So if you have your Bibles or your phone app and for the Bible, and you want to turn to Nehemiah chapter 11, I'd like you to do that. It's always a good habit to get into, so that way you can always check what's in there. Today's text is going to have a lot of names and a lot of numbers in there, and so you can feel free to read that as we go along. And you're going to wonder, how is it that we're going to talk about this text in a way that's going to make sense to us? Well, allow me to do that for you, but I'm going to start us off with a question. It's a serious question, okay? How dedicated are you to God? It's actually a really big question, isn't it? Maybe allow me to ask this question in a couple different ways. How would you rate your loyalty to God? What would you be willing to do to honor God? What would you be willing to sacrifice for God? And on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the highest level of commitment, how would you rate your dedication to serving God? As I mentioned, today's text is full of names and places, numbers. In fact, it will feel quite familiar in some ways to passages that we saw earlier in Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a very detail-oriented person. He made a great leader. He was able to adapt and to strategize. And in today's chapter, Nehemiah is going to give us a whole bunch more detail, the likes of which, as I mentioned, don't make great stories. However, it does give us pause. In some ways, it feels like we're reading a census. Names, family names, number of people. It should make us pause, though, and ask, what is this really about? Why are these details here? Why did God include this into the Bible? I think part of what and why these details are here is so that we can understand what's happening in their part of the world and the difficulties they faced and the dedication that they had. That these were real people with real issues, real problems, and the real command of God to rebuild the walls and the worship in Jerusalem. And this was no small thing. And they had to seriously look, as we have looked in previous chapters, the dedication they needed to get and have for God, even including the amount of stuff they needed to sacrifice and give and donate just so that worship can happen. And so today I want to share briefly with you about chapter 11 and the highlights I see here in the text. And one thing you may notice in this text today is that God is not talked about, but everything in the text, every name, every number, every detail is about the worship of God. It's about dedication. It's about reestablishing the people of God there and making sure that the main things stay the main things. There was a boy named Eric. He was born with a disease called retinoschisis. And by the time he was 13, he was completely blind. Rather than focus on what he could not do, he made the choice to focus on what he could do. And he went much further than most of anybody ever thought. In May of 2001, Eric Wainmeyer accomplished something that only about 150 people per year do. He reached the top of Mount Everest. He was blind, and he made it. Think about that dedication. Dedication to God and the worship of God is central to today's text. Even though it is filled with names and places, much like the names and places of the wall of Jerusalem in Nehemiah chapter 3, and the people who rebuilt those sections. And we looked and recognized that with those people there in those sections, that's like us and the ministries that we have here. The dedication and the work that we put into the ministries we're involved here and how we serve God. Not just here, even in our church, but serve God with all of who we are and in every way, wherever we go, at all times. Also in Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 4, it says that that Nehemiah noticed that there weren't many people living in the city of Jerusalem. That was a problem. And so today's chapter is to help rectify that situation, because without more people in the city, there's going to be continued security issues. If you don't have enough people to protect your city, what do you do? And if you don't have enough people to rebuild the homes and things that were wrecked within the town and clean things up and to establish trade and economy within the city, what do you do? So they're going to be addressing the subject of population within the city itself. Nehemiah needs more people. And so the leaders and the people create a plan. And so let's take a look at what's happening here in the text today. The point number 1 this morning is the resettlement. Now, allow me to read the first 4 verses for us in chapter 11. And it says, "Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of every 10 of them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. The people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. These are the provincial leaders who settled in Jerusalem. Now some Israelites, priests, Levites, temple servants, and descendants of Solomon's servants lived in the towns of Judah, each to their own property in the various towns, while other people from both Judah and Benjamin lived in Jerusalem." So the first thing that we're going to notice in this text is quite interesting, is that they cast lots to see who would leave their hometowns and move into the city. 1/10 of them, they tithed themselves. That's what they did. They tithed themselves. Think about the dedication here. It's incredible to think about that. For those of you who don't live in the town of Crossfield, imagine, for the sake of the town of Crossfield and for the worship of God, we were all to cast lots, and if you drew that short straw, you were to leave your home and move into town. Do you see the commitment that they made here? It is absolutely crazy. Leave what they had, reestablish themselves in the city. You see, they believed so strongly in the revitalization and the restoration of Jerusalem that they were willing to commit to moving just because they drew the short straw. It's like, yeah, we're good with this plan. Let's hope it's them. Those are the bad neighbors. Let them move out of the area. Some of you might have some bad neighbors. It's like, yeah, that'd be nice if they moved. Well, 1/10 of them moved into the city. So they built the population of Jerusalem, and the logistics of that, who knows how smoothly that went. Moving family and who knows what else, just to be able to do that. Did they sell their property? What did they do with their cattle and with their livestock and everything else if they were farmers? Like, what did they do? We're not given those details. But this chapter highlights the personal sacrifice people made for God. And so the questions at the outset of my message today become a bit more pointed, don't they? What level of commitment do we have to ensure the worship of God goes unhindered? Granted, those were different times and different situations as the people of Israel were returning from exile, and they were there to rebuild walls, the temple, the homes, and renew the worship of God. Very different times. But if I were to ask you a common question that gets asked by so many different authors, what is the spiritual temperature and commitment level of Christians in Canada today? How would you answer that? Now, while it would be way too easy to judge and condemn on one hand, depending on who you thought about, or to encourage and praise because of who you thought about, my purpose here today is for us to do a self-evaluation. What's my commitment? Marla Runyon gave her all to qualify for the Olympic Games in 1996. But her best time for running finished short of the mark to make the United States team. Now, she was undeterred by that failure, and she returned in 2000 and made the team for the Sydney Olympics. Her 8th place finish in the 1,500-meter race was the best finish ever for a United States woman runner. The thing that makes Runyon's accomplishments even more remarkable is that she is legally blind. She is the first legally blind athlete to ever qualify for and compete in the Olympic Games. And after her Olympic career was over, she switched to running marathons. And in 2002, posted the second fastest debut marathon time ever by an American woman. Runyon can only see shapes and blurs. But she says that her lack of vision is actually an asset. She just focuses on the finish line in front of her rather than looking around to see what all the other runners are doing. And not having visual distractions help her compete and win her races. And I think the same thing can be true in our lives as well. There will always be things to distract us. And our eyes need to be fixed on the prize. The author of Hebrews says, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith." What's our dedication and commitment level? How fixed are our eyes? Now, while the resettlement here for Jerusalem is taking place, and 1/10 of them are going to be moving in, and don't forget, you're also losing 1/10 of the surrounding area, so people are going to notice other people have moved away. It shakes up community a lot when you do stuff like that. But what area, or like, what's the context? What does this look like? What are the logistics? You know, when you think about that many people leaving their homes and moving someplace else, what are we talking about? How big of a scope is this? Where are they all coming from? Well, let's look at point number 2, the landscape. Now, this is maybe a bit more of a geography lesson for us here at this point, but throughout the series in Nehemiah, we have primarily focused on the city of Jerusalem and the outlying area that's called Judah at this time. The regional governors in the area that are surrounding them have been causing them trouble and threatening them from all sides. But what does that look like? Now, if you remember in the past, and maybe you've seen some maps of Israel in the past, you will remember that Israel was a fairly stretched out nation along the Mediterranean Sea, right? It's tall but skinny. Let's take a look at this map now so that we can see what's really going on. The area that is now known as Judah, and I'm going to turn around here for you, is that light green section close to the bottom there. You'll see that purplish section, that's Idumea, and just north of that is the Judah area. That's it. It is really tiny compared to what Judah used to be. This small area, I mean, when you think about the allotment of land that Israel had from north to south and east to west that they had to, they're not in charge and in command of it anymore. Remember, they went into exile and other people groups took over. Now, there might be pockets of Jewish settlements all throughout these different areas, absolutely. But the area that Nehemiah is dealing with is this small little green area, this square-shaped spot. You see, this is going to be a long, hard road for them. How did they get back what they lost? Territorial expansion of the Holy Land ended a long time ago, long before Nehemiah was born. And God promises the restoration of his people. And so how does he make sense of this? The king of Persia did not command Nehemiah to engage in any type of militaristic conquest. That's not part of his job here. And so we also want to remember that this is not the time of the judges, where God would raise up a judge and they would fight their neighbors and retake land that would have been taken from them. The focus in Nehemiah is not about military conquest. It's about the reestablishment of holiness in Jerusalem. They've got to get the main things. The nation of Israel is incredibly weak at this point. I mean, they have to, and they always should have, relied upon God to reestablish and to build and to protect and to care for them as they followed his covenant, and they messed that up over and over and over again. Like, the story is just, it's riddled with it. And yet God was faithful then, and he's faithful now. But God doesn't change. The Israelites here are outnumbered and outgunned. And God is not commanding Nehemiah to pick a fight. And so today's text is all about personal commitment and sacrifice for one purpose. There was a historian, his name was Thomas C. Reeves, who for many years was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, and he wrote this. He said, Christianity in modern America. Now remember, he's a historian. He's been studying Christianity in different times and different places. And he says, Christianity in modern America is in large part innocuous. It tends to be easy, upbeat, convenient, and compatible. It does not require self-sacrifice, discipline, humility, an otherworldly outlook, a zeal for souls, a fear as well as love for God. He doesn't have very nice things to say about the Christian church in the United States, does he? And he continues, and with the idea that God did not save us solely so that we could go to heaven. That's true. We're going to heaven. But God calls and commands us to have an impact here on earth as well. And when we trade the shame of the cross of Christ for the plaudits and acceptance of people and men and of our community so that we don't offend them and we just want their praises, we have forfeited the power to shake the world. And he goes on to say that far better to be despised and even persecuted than to live a life without making a difference for God. And so we have to ask ourselves, in our very comfortable nation, what's my commitment and dedication to God? With the Israelites' resettlement in a hostile area, with much of their former land owned and operated by other people groups, we now need to understand the purpose of the text. So let's go to point number 3, the purpose. Now, I've thought a lot about the purpose of what is happening in this text and in the book of Nehemiah, and I have thought a lot about the purpose of life in general for humanity. I've been thinking about the purpose of my life and the purpose of our church's life. And so let me ask you the question. What is the purpose of your life? Now, you're going to have some interesting things happening in your mind if you think similar to the way I do. You have Sunday school answers right there. Give God glory. And then you start asking yourself, but am I always doing that? Is the purpose of my life really focused and dedicated to give God glory? Or am I just trying to get the best out of this world as possible before I go to heaven? And I've been asking some really, really hard questions, and I would encourage you to do the same. I want you to be honest with the answers that you come up with, and just allow the answers to be what they are, and then respond appropriately to them. Because when we know how we've been living and thinking and what we're dedicated to, and we say, you know what, there's some things that God is going to be talking to me about. There's some things he's going to address and say, you know what, Barry, that needs to change. And it's hard to make changes, isn't it? How many of you ever struggled with patience? Yeah. Some of you are kind of, you know. It's hard to to be patient, isn't it? And don't raise your hands for the, how many of you struggle to be generous? It's like, I like keeping what I have. Or I don't like lending out what I have. You know, and I've struggled with that, still do from time to time. Yeah, there's a number of different struggles we'll go through as Christians as we evaluate the purpose of our life, and we say, you know, the aura and the attitude and the presence that I bring into the room, what is that? Hopefully it's more than just the smell of cinnamon buns, because I've been in the kitchen. What do I bring? What do I live for? When people look at me, how do they feel? And you know, those are very hard questions to think through. They can be fun at times. But it really asks the question about purpose. Why are we here? Not just why are we here on this planet? Why are we here in this church? Why are you sitting in the chairs today? Why do you live the way that you do? Say the things you say. Why? One of golf's immortal moments came when a Scotchman demonstrated the new game of golf to President Ulysses Grant. Carefully placing the ball on the tee, he took a mighty swing. The club hit the turf and scattered dirt all over the president's beard and surrounding vicinity. I think those of you who have golf know exactly what I'm talking about. It's kind of funny when it happens to somebody else. And yet, while the dirt spread all over the president, the ball placidly waited on the tee. Again, the Scotchman swung. Again, he missed. The president waited patiently through 6 tries and then patiently stated, "There seems to be a fair amount of exercise in the game, but I fail to see the purpose of the ball." So what's the purpose here in this text? What am I trying to drive at? What's Nehemiah trying to point us towards here? Why the names and the numbers and the details? The purpose of what they are doing by returning to Jerusalem and rebuilding is about worshiping God. Last week we learned that worshiping God costs money and supplies, and each person is able to contribute to that cause so that the worship of God can continue. But do we want to see the worship of God becoming half-hearted and mediocre or complacent? Because isn't that something that I can say about myself, that sometimes my worship is complacent? Yeah. Do we want it to leave it there? Do we want to pursue as individuals or even as a church together? Do we want to pursue the worship of God with zeal, with passion, and with doing the best that we can for God? Or is it okay just to leave it as good enough? Worshiping God is not just about making sure that we have opportunity, because you have opportunity every second of your day. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But we also to pursue God with zeal, with commitment, with dedication. And for example, take a look at the ministries that you are involved in. How do you serve in the church? And let's just narrow it down. How do you specifically serve in the church? And if you're saying, well, I don't really have a role in serving the church, maybe for those of you who are new to our church, just evaluate like our worship team up here, because they were up here and they're giving their all to God. For those of you and for everybody who serves, it takes practice and it takes time to learn more and more and to do better and better. The endeavor to not lead with mediocrity or laziness, but to strive for excellence in some way. The journey towards it, if I could put it like that. Because to become great at something or excel at something does not come easy. It takes years upon years of practice, trial and error, with a bunch of successes along the way. It takes teamwork to make the dream work. It takes dedication to work together along with time and practice to get into sync. Have you ever had a teacher, and I know I've had teachers when I was in elementary school. Have you ever had an elementary teacher that you wish you just never had? I had one. She was mean. She liked me for some reason, but I still didn't trust her. I passed grade 3, and that's the year that she taught me. But how are we doing this? Like, are we becoming better at what we do? Or has it just become good enough? And I want to address that. Not because we only accept excellence in the church. No, what we accept is the pursuit towards doing better. The development of ourselves for the worship and glory of God. Why? Because that's how God created us. He didn't create you with the gifts and the talents that you have at their maximum level when you were born. You are to strive and develop them the whole way through. Why? Because the striving and developing it is part of the worship of God. And so you don't have to worry that you're not excellent at things today. You're on a journey. As long as that journey doesn't stop. Here's a question for you regarding music, and I like talking about music in this regard because it's funny. Would you rather have guitars out of tune, a team that doesn't work together, people who don't practice, and an unauthorized tambourine out of sync with everyone else? Of course not. That becomes a distraction, doesn't it? Sure it does. So when our teams continue to practice and strive and give their best to God, along with striving to become better for the sake of God, then what we can do as Christians is reclaim excellence as part of our worship. The journey towards it. That we're not scared to become great at something. Because we're afraid that becoming great at something means that we're showing off. It's not showing off to show your skills that you're great at something. Unless you intend it to be that way. That's part of our worship, is to become better at what we do. And this doesn't just apply to music, it applies to every aspect of our church, every ministry you're in, including administration, and showing up on time for your meetings, which is kind of funny, right? Because sometimes it's like, oh yeah, there's Doug. He showed. No, I'm kidding. I'm just picking on Doug. 'Cause Doug lets me pick on him because he'll pick on me back. Right? Like, we're striving to become better at what we do. It's an act of worship to God. It's a sign of respect and love towards people. And so we reclaim the journey towards becoming great in what God has called us to do as our worship. Offer your bodies as living sacrifices. So it's your spiritual act of worship. We read that this morning. So we should never fall into a binary trap of thinking, which focuses either that for instance, if we talk about, music up here, that it's just performance or worship. No, that's binary thinking on that matter. That's not the way we're working here. Our teams are using their gifts and their dedication and their sacrifice for God in their worship, both in terms of developing their skills through their practice as an act of worship and also leading us in a heartfelt, genuine way as they're worshiping God while they're leading us. Everything we do is an act of worship to God if we make it, including peeling carrots, changing a diaper, and not hitting the snooze button too many times because you're going to be late for something. Because we're dedicated and committed to living for God in all that we do. If anything, what we can do is just pull ourselves back and realize that we can really be giving a lot more thanks to people for their service. Thank you. I thank you for what you do. I see the commitment. I see the sacrifice. I see the generosity. I see the smiles. I see the love. In Nehemiah 11, we have leaders, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, descendants of Judah and Benjamin, and all the rest of them. Their job was to do whatever it took to reestablish worship. It's about personal sacrifice and commitment to God, including the pursuit of doing things well. Take some time, if you're wondering, where in the Scriptures do you see where we needed to do things excellent in the Scriptures? Take some time, if you're interested, in reading about the building of the temple and the artifacts of worship in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and 4. There you will see a dedication to craft. And so let us together as a church family learn the lessons of what the Israelites are trying to do here in the text and in this story of Nehemiah. To not let fear govern us by worrying about the people who are singing or playing or leading us in worshiping God, or worrying about the nations and people around us that might seek to condemn Christians or oppose our worship of God. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus. Let's learn the lessons of the Bible. There was a pastor who tells of a story of when he visited a refugee camp at Eglin Air Base in 1970s, just after the Vietnam War. And when he was there, he found hundreds of refugees huddled under tents. Some were learning English, some were filling out government forms, some were being taught how to cook. Children were playing games. In the temporary chapel there was a group singing in their native tongue, leaning on the everlasting arms. Here were people who had lost everything. They lost everything but their lives and their faith. And they were singing these words: "What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms." So it doesn't matter if you're wealthy or poor. It doesn't matter if you have everything or lost everything. Are you being that living sacrifice? Our role and purpose in life is to worship God in all we do and the way we do it. And so what has God spoken to you about today? Here's a text with names and numbers. It would be absolutely boring just to open it up and read it and say, wow, that was riveting. But the heart behind it, the dedication behind it, the passion behind it, the reason why it's written is so that we have a testimony to show us what God requires. And He requires everything. Because that's how He created us. Today we sung the song Heart of Worship. We also praised God for being the Almighty God. We lifted God's name on high in the music this morning. That God is faithful and that He is our everlasting Father. And shortly we're going to remember and sing that God is holy forever. Now, whatever we might think about our preferences in worship, styles of music, whether you like tambourines or not, remember the purpose. Remember the commitment. Remember the sacrifices we can make because our God is great. Remember that our lives are not our own. Remember that God has standards by which we need to live. Remember that the trials of each week are an opportunity to honor God. Remember the joys of each week are an opportunity to thank God. And as our worship team is going to come up here now, and they're going to lead us in another song, let us break out of the fears in this life that imprison us and prevent us from living fully and unabashedly with God. Let us surrender all that we are and all that we have to God. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus in music, in prayer, in working and in driving. And let's ask Him, God, all week long to guide us in worship and reveal more of His love. Not only does this great God love all of you, but He is also holy. He is not only deserving of our worship here this morning, but He is also worthy of our pursuit to worship God with excellence in dedication and sacrifice in all we do. All I am and all I have is for you.